You could try to go back. After all, nothing is stopping you. The same people are still there. The same conversations are still happening. The same roles are still waiting for you. From the outside, nothing has really changed. And yet, when you try to respond the way you used to, something doesn't fully move. The reaction begins, but doesn't complete. The words come, but feel slightly off. The emotional pull is still there, but weaker now, less convincing, almost optional. And that's where it becomes unsettling, because this isn't about losing control. It's about losing access. Access to the version of yourself that once made everything feel natural. The part of you that explained without thinking, adjusted without noticing, kept connection moving without effort. You can still imitate it, but it no longer feels like you. And the more you notice that difference, the harder it becomes to ignore what it means. Something has changed, not on the surface, but in the structure underneath how you respond to life. And once that structure shifts, going back is no longer a choice. It's no longer possible in the same way. What changes first is not what you do. It's what no longer happens automatically. There was a time when certain moments would pull you forward without hesitation. You didn't have to think about how to respond or decide whether to engage. The movement was already there, forming on its own, shaping your reactions before you even noticed it. A pause in a conversation would register as something to fill. A shift in tone would signal something to adjust. A subtle tension would invite you to step in and restore balance. And you would, not as a strategy, not as an effort, as instinct. It felt natural to clarify, to soften, to keep the exchange moving in a way that preserved connection. Most of the time, you weren't even aware that you were doing it. It simply felt like participation. But now that same moment appears, and the movement doesn't fully form. You still recognize the signal. You still understand what is happening, often more clearly than before. But the response no longer rises with the same force. It begins, and then hesitates, as if something inside you is no longer convinced that it needs to complete itself. And that hesitation is new. Not dramatic enough to be called change. Not strong enough to feel like resistance, but present enough to alter everything that follows. Because once that automatic movement weakens, something else becomes visible. You begin to see how much of your connection to others depended on what you supplied without noticing. The way you kept things moving, without realizing you were the one doing it. None of it felt artificial. In many cases, it came from care, from sensitivity, from a genuine desire to keep things aligned without creating friction. But it was still movement. And now, with less of that movement in place, the interaction changes shape. Some moments continue without needing anything from you. They hold their own rhythm, their own coherence. Others begin to feel slightly uneven, not because something is wrong, but because something that once sustained them is no longer happening in the same way. And this is where the shift becomes harder to ignore, because you're not doing something different. You're no longer doing something you once did without realizing. And that difference is subtle, but it changes how everything feels. This shift becomes easier to recognize when you are in the middle of an interaction that once felt familiar. Someone brings up something you've heard before, a familiar pattern that usually unfolds in the same way. You recognize it almost immediately, not just what's being said, but how it usually unfolds. And for a long time, you would have entered that space without hesitation. You would follow the emotional current, respond in rhythm, and participate in a way that helped carry the exchange forward. Not because you were trying to manage it, but because something in you naturally moved toward what was happening. Now, you remain present, but you don't enter in the same way. You listen, but you don't merge with what is being said. You understand the emotional tone, but you are no longer pulled into it with the same immediacy. There is a slight distance, not from the person, but from the automatic movement that once connected you to the moment. That difference is subtle, but it changes the structure of the interaction. Because without that immediate participation, the exchange has to sustain itself. Sometimes it does, and nothing feels out of place. The conversation continues, the rhythm holds, and the connection remains intact without requiring anything additional from you. And without that automatic participation, something becomes visible that wasn't before. Other times, something begins to shift. Not enough to create conflict, but enough to be felt. And this is where a deeper realization begins to form. You start to see that you were not only part of these interactions, you were helping shape how they unfolded. And once you see that, you can't fully participate the same way again. The way you responded influenced the tone, the pacing, and even the direction of the exchange, often in ways that were invisible at the time. Now, with less of that influence in place, the dynamic becomes clearer. Some interactions continue without needing anything from you. They are stable on their own, able to hold connection without constant adjustment. Others begin to feel slightly heavier, not because they are more intense, but because they seem to rely on something that is no longer happening automatically. And once you notice that difference, it becomes difficult to ignore. Because what you are seeing is not just a change in how you respond. You are seeing how the interaction itself was being sustained. And this is where the experience becomes more difficult to ignore. Because at some point, it stops feeling like a subtle shift, and starts to feel like something is off. Not in the situation. In you. There are moments when you notice your own response, and it feels unfamiliar. Almost as if you're slightly out of sync with yourself. You hear what you say, you observe how you react, and for a brief second, it doesn't fully match the version of you that you were used to being. Nothing is clearly wrong, and that's what makes it harder to understand, and that creates a quiet kind of discomfort. Not strong enough to be called anxiety, not clear enough to be explained, but present enough to make you question what's happening. You may find yourself wondering if you've become distant, or less engaged, or somehow less present than you used to be. Because the signals you once relied on are no longer guiding you in the same way. And without those signals, it can feel like something essential is missing. This is often where the impulse to return begins. Because for the first time, you don't feel fully like the person you used to be. Not because you consciously decide to go back, but because you want to restore that sense of familiarity. The feeling of knowing exactly how to respond. The ease of moving through interactions without hesitation. So in small moments, you try. You lean in a little more. You respond a little faster. You attempt to re-enter the rhythm that once felt effortless. And sometimes, on the surface, it works. The conversation flows again. The interaction feels smoother. The familiar version of you briefly reappears. But something underneath it doesn't fully settle. Because even as you move through that familiar pattern, you can feel the difference. It no longer feels entirely aligned with where you are now. The movement is there, but it carries a subtle sense of dissonance. And that is what makes this stage confusing. You are not trying to change, but you can no longer fully be who you were. And for a while, that can feel like a kind of loss. Not of people, but of familiarity with yourself. At first, this change seems contained within you. It feels like something private, almost invisible. Something that only you can notice because it lives in the way you experience your own responses. But over time, It begins to appear in the space between you and other people. Not through anything you say. Through what no longer happens. Nothing is explicitly wrong. But something is missing. And even when it's not named, it is often felt. You may notice it in the way someone looks at you for a second longer than usual, as if trying to understand what has changed. Or in the way a question is asked, lightly, almost casually, but carrying a quiet uncertainty underneath. You seem different. Is everything okay? The words themselves are simple, but they point to something real. Because what others are sensing is not a change in your intention. It's a change in your participation. For a long time, the way you engaged may have helped maintain the emotional rhythm of your interactions. You responded quickly, adjusted naturally, and moved with the moment in a way that kept everything aligned without drawing attention to it. Now, with that movement reduced, the dynamic has to reorganize. Some people respond by leaning in. They speak more, ask more, or subtly increase the intensity of the interaction, as if trying to bring things back to what they were. There is a sense of reaching, of attempting to re-establish a familiarity that no longer forms in the same way. Others respond differently. They become quieter, more reserved, or slightly distant, not out of rejection, but because the interaction no longer feels predictable, and without that predictability, something in them pulls back. In both cases, the effect is similar. The connection begins to change shape. Not abruptly, and not through conflict, but through small adjustments that accumulate over time. Some interactions simply don't extend the way they used to, and this is often where the experience starts to feel more personal, because what was once internal is now reflected back to you through others. You may begin to wonder whether you are becoming harder to connect with, or whether something essential in the way you relate has shifted too far. The change, which once felt subtle and almost neutral, now carries a weight that is harder to ignore. But what is happening here is not disconnection. It is exposure. Without the same level of automatic adjustment, the structure of each relationship becomes more visible. Some connections continue without needing anything extra. They hold naturally, without requiring constant reinforcement. Others begin to loosen, not because they were false, but because they depended on something you are no longer providing in the same way. And once that difference becomes visible, it is difficult to return to not seeing it. The part that is rarely spoken about is what this shift quietly takes from you. Not people, not opportunities, something more subtle than that. It takes away the version of you that knew how to move through everything without questioning it. There was a kind of ease in that, a familiarity in knowing how to respond, how to maintain connection, how to stay aligned with what was expected, not as pressure, but as something that felt natural. You didn't have to think about it. You didn't have to choose. You simply moved with it. And now, that ease begins to fade. Not all at once, but enough that you start to notice what is no longer automatic. Carl Jung described this kind of moment in a very specific way. Not as loss, but as differentiation. A separation between who you learned to be and what actually feels true now. A point where the psyche begins to separate what is truly yours from what was learned, adapted, or unconsciously maintained over time. And that process is not comfortable, because what begins to fall away is not something you consciously rejected. It's something that once felt like you. The way you held connection together without thinking about it. All of it worked. All of it made sense at the time. But it was also shaped by patterns, subtle forms of adaptation that kept things stable, often without you realizing how much they were guiding your behavior. And as those patterns loosen, something changes. You don't immediately replace them. You don't step into a new version of yourself with the same clarity. Instead, you begin to feel the gap between what is familiar and what is actually aligned. And that gap is where the discomfort appears. Because once you can see that difference, you can't move blindly in the same way again, even when it would be easier, even when it would make things smoother, even when it would restore a sense of familiarity. Something in you hesitates, not out of resistance, but out of recognition. And that recognition creates a new kind of weight. There are moments now where you could respond exactly as before, step into the same role, and allow everything to flow the way it used to. And yet, you feel the distance, the subtle misalignment between that response and where you are now. And for a brief second, you are aware of something that wasn't visible before. You are no longer just reacting. You are choosing, not between right and wrong, but between what is familiar and what is true. If this shift were clear, it would be easier to move through it. But it isn't. It doesn't arrive as a decision you can stand behind, or a realization you can fully trust. It shows up as a difference you feel, and that difference doesn't always make sense at first. There are moments when you question it, moments when the old way of responding still seems easier, more natural, more socially aligned. Not because it is more true, but because it is more familiar. And familiarity has its own kind of gravity. So you find yourself in situations where the tension becomes more visible. You feel it immediately, even before you can explain it. And for a moment, you consider ignoring it, because returning would make everything easier, at least on the surface. You respond the way you used to. You move into the same patterns. You say what you know will keep things smooth. You step into the version of yourself that once made everything feel effortless. And sometimes, it works. The interaction flows. The tension dissolves. The familiar rhythm returns. But the resolution doesn't last. Because the discomfort doesn't come from the situation. It comes from the awareness you now carry. And that awareness doesn't disappear when the moment passes. It stays. Quietly, steadily, changing how you experience what used to feel automatic. This is where the tension deepens, not because something is wrong, but because you can no longer fully abandon what you now see, even when doing so would be easier, even when it would make you more understood, more accepted, more aligned with what others expect from you. There is a part of you that recognizes the cost of returning. Not externally, internally. A subtle sense that you would be moving against something that has already shifted within you. And over time, that becomes harder to ignore. Because this is not a tension between you and other people. It's a tension between two ways of being. One that is familiar, efficient, and easy to step back into. And another that is quieter, less defined, but increasingly difficult to leave behind. At first, you may move between them. Sometimes you return to what feels known. Sometimes you remain with what feels true. There is no clean transition, no immediate resolution, just a gradual recognition that one of these ways requires less awareness, and the other requires honesty. And slowly, without needing to decide it directly, you begin to stay where the honesty is, not because it is easier, but because it is no longer possible to fully go back. And over time, that tension begins to change, not because it disappears, but because you stop trying to resolve it. At first, the impulse to fix it is still there, to choose one way over the other, to return to what feels familiar or fully commit to what feels true. But neither of those movements holds in the same way. So something else happens instead. You stay with it. And as you do, the experience begins to shift. Not dramatically, and not all at once, but in a quieter way that doesn't require a clear decision. The tension that once felt like something you needed to solve starts to lose its urgency. It's still there, but it no longer pulls you in the same way, because you begin to see something more clearly. What felt like loss was never exactly loss. It was the absence of something you no longer needed to sustain. The version of you that once moved automatically, that responded without pause, that held everything together without question. It wasn't false, but it also wasn't entirely free. It worked, but it required more from you than you realized. Not a stronger version of you, not a more evolved version, just a more accurate one. You are no longer entering every interaction to maintain it. You are allowing it to show you what it is, without needing to intervene. Some connections remain, and they feel different, quieter, less dependent on effort, less driven by emotional momentum. They don't need to be constantly adjusted to hold together. They simply hold. Others begin to loosen, not dramatically, not through conflict, but with a quiet sense that something that once sustained them is no longer there. And instead of trying to restore that, you begin to let the difference exist, without forcing it, without correcting it, without stepping back into a role that no longer feels fully aligned. And this is where something settles more deeply. And that's when something shifts in a deeper way. You stop trying to go back, not because you can't, but because you no longer need to. The familiarity that once pulled you is still visible. You can see it, you can understand it, but it no longer carries the same weight. And that is when the shift becomes stable. Not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer divided between what feels true and what feels familiar. If you've reached that point, where going back no longer feels possible, even when you try, then what changes next is not what most people expect. Because this shift doesn't just affect how you feel. It changes how you move through everything. The way you respond, the way you relate, and the small behaviors that once felt invisible. And that's exactly what we explore in the next video.